What if I told you that one of the biggest contributors to massive urban sprawl and car dependency comes from a little known and largely arbitrary section found in many city ordinances? Minimum parking requirements are regulations for how much off-street parking is required for any given establishment, and although they seem harmless, they have rippling consequences throughout communities. Simply eliminating these ordinances has the potential to greatly improve any city. Minimum parking laws exist to alleviate the problem of on-street parking. So for example, if an establishment like a movie theater requires lots of cars to park for a long period of time, if they were all parking on the street, surrounding businesses would be unable to accommodate customers. But through providing off-street parking provisions, it mandates each business to have enough parking to meet their customers' needs. That's why they were created. The problem with minimum parking requirements is that they make other forms of transportation much more difficult and makes the price of new developments much more expensive, further restricting city growth. Often, minimum parking requirements are built to accommodate peak hours, and this means that most of the time, these lots are just sitting empty. Minimum parking requirements also presuppose that people are driving, making other forms of transportation like walking, public transportation, and bicycles much less effective. It turns into a self-fulfilling prophecy as minimum parking requirements spread out our cities, making other forms of transportation more difficult, making cities more car dependent, which further validate the minimum parking requirements to begin with. If more places were designed with alternative forms of transportation in mind, we wouldn't need all this parking. These walking areas are not possible in many cities because of the minimum parking requirement. What makes this even worse is many places require parking that's bigger than the establishment itself, necessitating urban sprawl. For example, in my hometown of Atlanta, some business districts require one parking spot for every 100 square feet of an establishment. The city ordinances also require parking spots to be 180 square feet with up to 300 square feet for maneuvering. This creates a system where urban sprawl is guaranteed because the parking space is 2 to 3 times the size of the establishment they serve. These parking requirements are often based off square footage. But for example, Powder Springs, Georgia has a requirement for 3 parking spaces for every 1 lane in a bowling alley. Very arbitrary. These minimum parking laws could be justified if there was significant rationale for the amount of parking required in the minimum parking requirements. However, most of these minimum parking laws are very arbitrary and are just copied from surrounding cities, creating a system where everybody is just copying everybody else. Furthermore, most developers don't consider the price of parking when making these laws. For example, a surface lot parking space can cost over $10,000, and when that's not factored in to the minimum parking laws, it creates a system where developers don't want to build, and it just drastically spreads out our cities. If there was a scientific or data-driven approach to the minimum parking laws, I would be far more likely to support them. But simply right now, they're just rule of thumb rather than data-driven, which I think is very bad. Added prices get passed on to consumers, further hurting customers who aren't even driving to establishments by using other forms of transportation. Many apartments also have mandatory minimum parking requirements, which makes building affordable housing much more difficult. On average, including parking with rent, increases the rent prices by $200. Some developers in Los Angeles have tried to convert old office buildings into affordable housing, but the minimum parking requirements force them to combine and demolish rooms because they couldn't afford to build the extra parking required for the minimum parking requirements. The minimum parking requirements in cities makes building profitable, affordable housing much more difficult. When developers are forced to build more parking than what is profitable, they become far more likely to drop the project entirely or change it into a more highly profitable apartment complex rather than providing affordable housing, further increasing the price for renters and making living in the city more difficult, further expanding the amount of people driving into the city. The solution to preventing all of these problems is simply to eliminate minimum parking laws from our city ordinances. We need to find the proper balance of supply and demand that the market requires and let developers build the appropriate amount of parking for their establishment. This will inevitably lead to a situation where during peak times, the parking lots will not be able to accommodate everybody. And because of this, it is far more likely that we will have paid parking lots where you must pay to enter the parking lot. This does not necessarily have to be a bad thing. It encourages other people to find alternative forms of transportation to accommodate the best use of all of our land. As Shoup says, minimum parking laws depend on the assumption that the demand for parking does not depend on price and the supply for parking does not depend on cost. These assumptions are turning our downtown districts into wastelands that are not making the full use of their potential. Studies like those performed by CJ Gabb have shown reducing minimum parking laws can improve the productivity of our cities. It is a simple fact that parking is not a productive land use. And if we could use this land for other things like housing and businesses, our cities would be far more productive and better places to live. If we let the free market decide the proper amount of parking, we can have a far better use of all of our land and have far more productive cities that people will love to live in. This does not mean that we are going to eliminate all off-street parking. It instead allows for the appropriate amount of off-street parking that is needed throughout the day. Accommodating exclusively peak hours leads to empty spots that are desolate for 23 hours of day. Through eliminating minimum parking laws, we can better use our city's land and make everything better for those driving or using alternative forms of transportation. We can decrease costs, decrease congestion, and decrease urban sprawl. This is being done in a lot of cities already, but I want to see every city in the country eliminate their minimum parking laws so they can best use their land for their citizens. If you guys have any questions or comments, leave them below, and I'm excited to talk to you guys again in the next one.